My name is Neil Allen Parker. I'm an intern at Central Washington Library for this spring quarter, and it's my pleasure to present my lecture on what is research and how to approach research projects in an academic setting. So most of you will be, have looked at writing as a process of creating term papers. And as we're going to try to make clear during this lecture, there's a very big difference between a term paper and a research project. A term paper, right, is a relatively simple set of objectives. Your instructor will tell you what you want. They'll oftentimes point you at the sources you need to use for it, and then you just go do it and you're done. Research projects sort of remove a lot of these kind of training wheels, for lack of a better word. A research project it requires you to choose your own topic, to select kind of your own question or that you would like to solve, and to go out and find the sources that will enable you to adequately answer that question. So, next slide, please. So, the first thing we're going to do is talk a little bit about what good research projects should entail. So, good research should turn a vague interest into a problem readers think is worth posing and solving. You want to think about research projects not as something that you have to do, but something that you're legitimately interested in. So, most of us, in the context of higher education, have certain topics that we want to study. In your case, I believe you're taking a class in psychology and focusing primarily on, how sort of men and women are depicted in popular media programs like television, advertisements, etc. So this is a very big topic, and a lot of people have done some really interesting work on it. So what you're going to do is you're going to look through kind of all the different little facets of that topic, and then pick something that seems like a vague interest. You're going to pick that vague interest, narrow it down into a topic, and then create a problem out of it. A problem that ideally the secondary literature will show you is something that's worth posing and worth solving. Next slide, please. So good research should also build an argument that motivates readers to take your claims seriously. So a lot of times when we write either for term papers or blog posts, just kind of whatever you're doing, you're presenting your opinion. So, you write your opinion based on what you personally feel is correct, and you might explain a little bit your thought process behind it. So research papers and the people that read these papers expect something different. Research papers are really focused around the evidence that you're able to collect. And while you might be able to work your opinion of that evidence in your topic, your first duty, your primary duty as a researcher, is to build that argument structured around the primary sources and the primary data that you've gathered. If you don't know what a primary source is, and as this is the first time that many of you are doing research papers, this is completely understandable, so we'll cover it briefly here. A primary source is sort of the raw data you gather about an event itself. For example, let's say I'm writing a research paper on, women in advertisements. So in this case, my primary sources will be the stock images I've gathered of whatever company I'm interested in with the actual advertisement. And that is my primary resource. So as I collect more of these primary resources constitute my data. So, when I'm building an argument about how this company is using these resources, or what the implications of these advertisements are, or how these advertisements sort of depict the participants, I'm always sort of keeping in mind the primary sources first, and then building that argument around it. This is what researchers expect, and this is really how scholarly inquiry is done. Next slide, please. Another part of the research process is anticipating the reservations of thoughtful, but at the same time critical readers. So, over the course of your school and academic experience, we're kind of conditioned to assume that criticism is a bad thing, that I'm criticized when I make a mistake, and it is my job, after making that mistake to go fix it. So ideally, when you're writing a term paper, you just want somebody to write, "Oh my God, best paper ever," and you're done. Research papers operate on a completely different set of rules. Criticism implies engagement. So let me tell you a little story. One of my professors in college was at a conference. He's a professor in European history. So he's going around introducing himself, like, hi, I'm Professor Smaldone, like, my expertise is German history. And, the people at the conference were like, oh, that's interesting. And then they might talk a little bit about, like, a relevant paper or, like, some other issue that had come up in his field that they thought was, interesting. What he noticed, though, was that there was one individual whose expertise was in the individual history of personal psychology of great leaders. And when he kind of tried to explain to the other sort of academics in the room what he was doing, all he got was, oh, good for you. So in the academic world, right, the words good for you are basically tantamount to, I don't really understand what you're doing and I don't really care about it. Research papers don't want to generate this reaction, right? This is, considered to be like a sort of failed form of research. We want, our work to attract the attention of other scholars. And then they're going to pose questions and criticisms and sort of inquire upon the line of work that we've done. So criticism, unlike, in a term paper, is actually a good thing. It means people are engaging with you, which is what you want. What you're really doing here, and sort of go out learning how to write your first research paper, is you're learning to enter a conversation. And that conversation, there's give and take, and not everyone agrees with each other. So the key to successfully joining that conversation is not necessarily being right, but to, acknowledge the disagreements within, sort of a scope of academic scholarly inquiry, and participate in that in a meaningful way. And part of that is, accepting that reservations of thoughtful and critical readers is actually a good thing. Next slide, please. So now that we've kind of covered what sort of good research does, there's one more point I want to stress before we get into the meat of it. Good research creates an introduction and a conclusion that answers a question, so what? So, as we kind of go through our experience in schools, we never really have to worry about, will someone read my writing? Because it's a given, right? You're going to write a paper, your instructor's going to pick it up, and they're going to give you a grade. And then that's the end of it. But, upon graduation, this model doesn't work anymore. No one's obligated to read your writing. No one's obligated to read your research at all. So it's incumbent upon you, as, a emerging researcher in the social sciences or, in any other discipline, to ask yourself, to create an introduction and a conclusion that, invites readers in, that seems interesting, that solves a meaningful question. So one thing as you're sort of building a research paper is to always kind of keep this so what question sort of framed like right in front of you, as in what is this paper accomplishing, or what am I doing with this? An example of a researcher who I think does this pretty well is a book by Lula Malek entitled Colonial Harem. So Colonial Harem takes a series of French postcards and then develops a so what of Algerian women, and develops a so what question out of it, essentially framing these postcards through the lens of sort of French colonialism and exploring how the depiction of Algerian women changed once sort of the insurgency in Algeria and the fighting intensified from 1910 to 1930, and then how this impacted the ways in which the French public was perceiving Algerian women. And it changed pretty markedly over time. But what Colonial Harem accomplishes is it's not like, oh, here's a bunch of postcards and I'm done. It's no, these are postcards that have an impact. They have a so what question. There's a reason why you as a reader should care about this. And this is why, Malek and Colonial Harem are considered one of the top books in the field of colonialist literature, is because Malek does such a good job of framing this sort of so what question. Now, you don't necessarily have to be that successful with sort of your own inquiries, and it's not a requirement, but it's a sign of your sort of intellectual maturity that you're starting to think about these issues. We're not going to be in school forever, but we are going to be writing for a very, very long time. And we want to be able to attract readers. So posing these so what questions draws readers in, and this is a good thing. Next slide, please. So the writing process is also useful as you sort of kind of develop your thinking, right? We don't, we're not making you write to torture you. There are legitimate things you can learn through this process. The first thing, of course, is write to remember. Unless you have a truly exceptional memory, and maybe some of you do, we simply can't hold sort of all of our thoughts up in here, and we need to write them down. So when I'm writing lesson plans, I like to think I have a pretty good memory, but I have to write things down and structure it. So, that I don't get off track and, you guys get sort of the best use out of your time here. So writing to remember is an important, tool, not only if you're doing research papers, but just in general. Writing to understand is, possibly just as crucial a point as writing to remember. So if you think about it, how many times have you had something that inside your head seems like really insightful or a great argument or like, a truly sort of earth-shaking way of reviewing how we sort of understand our world or a particular event. But then we notice that once we start talking about it with someone else, holes start appearing, areas where maybe our thinking isn't complete or fully flushed out, or we need to do a better job sort of developing the argument. Writing is kind of the pinnacle of that process, because as we write, we're really building something. And you can see, as you write things down, where the holes kind of appear, or where there are problems, or where you need to go back to address things. Writing is the best way to fully develop a thought or an idea. Which leads us to our last point. Write to test your thinking. So, having a great idea is wonderful. It's something that, hopefully all of you get to experience during your academic and professional careers. But writing is really kind of, the ultimate test of, does this idea work? Can I write it down in some way that somebody else who I haven't spoken to and who doesn't know me personally can look at my idea and evaluate it on its own merits? Anyway, next slide, please. So thinking about our readers is important. We've kind of covered this earlier, but these are 4 questions that will be really helpful to you as you sort of keep in mind during the writing process. And that's, who will read my report? This is a class paper, so your instructor will be reading your report and they'll have certain goals in mind. But in a general rule, think about it. Just because something starts out as a term paper does not mean, that you can't do more with it, or that this can't be something that you start with and then, want to come back to later and flesh out further. So focus on it. Who are my readers? What do they expect me to do? So in the case of a research project, we've talked a little bit about our expectations. Researchers expect you to understand the scholarly literature surrounding your topic and to sort of marry your argument to your primary sources and respect the limitations therein. So primary sources, limit the amount of sort of claims we were able to make. Now you always want to make sure your claims are derived from your primary sources. So it's like, based on the data I've collected, I can say this. It's not that you can make kind of a grand sweeping statement based on the data unless you truly have like a massive amount of information. You have to limit kind of your claims to the scope generated by your data. So for example, if I'm writing a paper on, how women are portrayed in like Nike running campaigns, I can't sit in upon the conclusion of that paper, I can't say, this is how all women are treated in all advertisements, because I don't know that. All I know, based on the data I've gathered, is how women are portrayed in Nike commercials. And that would be it. Now I can extrapolate and say, this is my analysis of sort of the depiction of these women in these advertisements. And we can look, if we look at other ad campaigns, we can see that we might be able to generalize this out further. And this might be, an area where I could possibly do further research. And that's how you get started, believe it or not. That sort of expansion and that thing where you can kind of push the boundaries of a project you've already sort of successfully completed. The last 2 points, though, I think, are particularly salient. I want to go over them here. So how much can I expect them to know already is really important. If you're writing for academics or a professional audience, you don't necessarily have to explain sort of every single little point. But if you're thinking about general readers, then maybe you want to back up and say, like, if a term seems really pertinent to a class and we use it a lot, but it might not be clear to, for example, your cousin, maybe you want to explain it in the paper. Since for this particular assignment, you're going to be working on a paper for your professor, it's fairly safe to assume that, your professor has a field of expertise with the subject matter. Now, if you run into like kind of a concept that's from outside of class, you're going to need to go ahead and explain it. But keep in mind that in this case, your reader is going to be the faculty. And they have certain expectations and a certain syllabus, and it's incumbent on you to follow that. And lastly, how will readers respond to the solution? So this kind of goes back to what we talked about earlier, right? But I'm going to go through a model that's going to explain like topic to question to problem. And out of that problem, the conclusion, you'll pose your solution to that problem. So your readers expect your solution to be warranted by the analysis that you've done. So you don't have to make big sweeping claims. This is not really what you accomplish in a research paper. Research papers are limited affairs. You're going to learn things like how to acknowledge discretion, how to acknowledge the limitations of the information that you've gathered. And this isn't, a reflection that you've done a bad paper. This is a reflection of your own intellectual maturity, that you can recognize the limits of your data and how that limits the claims you're able to make. This is something that's not only important in an academic setting, but obviously in a workplace as well. Next slide. So, with all that out of the way, let's talk about how you get started. So, these are a couple rules that I've drafted up that have always helped me when I'm writing research papers. Firstly, is find a topic specific enough to master in a reasonable amount of time. Maybe you are driven to answer the big questions. But you have to recognize that the big question, like how are women portrayed in popular media, is not something you can reasonably answer in a quarter. It's not something you can answer in your lifetime. We've been working on this, for literally almost 100 years. Literature has been produced on how women are depicted in advertisements or in literature or in books. There's no way to answer that question. So the first step really in this kind of topic process is to start narrowing it down and understand that, this is a quarter. You may have between 10 and 12 weeks to actually write this thing, in addition to all the other commitments you need to meet. So, when you're starting out, pick something narrow. 2, find an interesting question about your topic. As you can already have guessed, you're going to be doing a lot of work on this, so you might as well find a question that is actually engaging to you and that you actually want to answer. Don't write something because you think, oh, this is easy, or oh, this is sort of what someone else wants me to write. Write something that you want to write. It's much better this way. Obviously within the context of the syllabus, but research papers give you latitude. You're going to be writing a paper on some aspect of how men and women are portrayed in movies or advertisements, etc. There's a lot of different stuff you can choose from. So just choose something that's interesting to you. 3 is also a pretty good point. Determine the kind of evidence your readers will expect. So if you are working with sort of an advertisement campaign, you just want to make sure you can get access to those advertisements. If you're picking a TV show, just make sure you have access to the TV show and you can kind of sit down and do a little study and figure out the data that you need. The more kind of obscure or the more broad your topic becomes, you want to start kind of critically asking yourself if you actually have enough evidence to answer the question that you're trying to pose. Remember, it's not enough to sort of simply present your opinion. This is not how research works. As I've stressed a couple times during this presentation, research is limited to the data, the primary sources that you are able to collect. So if you can't get the kind of evidence you want, you can't answer the question. So, this also kind of covers into point 4, but it's something to think about, right? We are limited to our data, and we need to be smart about it. Next slide, please. So the model I'm going to be there's a couple different models for how to write research papers, but the one I've always found to be particularly helpful, especially to people who are just starting out, is this one, the topic, question, and problem model. These are all relatively straightforward. It's kind of simple steps you can go through, and it's fairly, as you'll see, self-explanatory almost. So topic, you're going to want to start by sort of casting your metaphorical net far and wide. At this point, anything is fair game. You can look at Reddit, you can look at Wikipedia, you can look at blogs, you can skim through Time Magazine if you want to. You're looking for an article or a viewpoint that, or an idea that just seems interesting. So a great thing you can also do at this stage is talk to your classmates, talk to people that might not be interested in this project. If you say something about men in advertisements that one of your coworkers thinks is really interesting, then you might just have found yourself a research project. So think of this as if we're fishing in on a boat. If you want to catch one fish, you're going to bait up your line and throw it in. This is more like a deep sea trawler. We just want to get as much sort of stuff as we possibly can until we find one little item or element that actually seems interesting. The golden rule of thumb though to follow is during the topic stage, you're not looking for articles or content that you're actually going to cite. You're just trying to get sort of a general idea of these issues. And once you find an issue that seems interesting, that's when you start narrowing it. Next slide, please. So now we're into the question stage. So questions are built on understanding the scholarly literature of your topic. If you're looking at, for example, women in an advertising campaign, I can almost guarantee that in the databases we will cover sort of later in this lecture, you're going to find, someone else who's already written something about that topic. Now, the questions is built out of the scholarly literature. Once you've found a topic or like kind of a vague interest, go to things like sociological abstracts or EBSCO and start poking around for academic and scholarly articles that are pertinent to your topic. Remember, you're trying to join a conversation, and that conversation is not like in popular media. It is within these sort of scholarly, peer-reviewed articles. So once you've sort of like gone through the secondary literature a little bit, start looking at a source that makes a claim you find persuasive. You can ask questions that might be extend upon its reach. This is like, example of extending an argument. For example, if I read, so I'm interested first, and again, going back to this women Nike thing, I'm interested in like how women are portrayed in Nike commercials. And, I'm poking around in sort of like Search Complete, and I find an article on how women are portrayed in, for example, Reebok commercials. And I look at the claims that, are made in the article, and I think, man, a lot of these seem to really apply to this Nike campaign as well. That's a question. So you can start saying, like, this is an article that's been done. This is the questions, posed by the author. Can we now extend this to a different ad campaign? And if you can do that, that's a really interesting piece of research. Another technique is turning what I call like positive questions into negative ones. So like if someone is saying my research can be extended into like, X, and Y different fields, try to prove them wrong. Like ask, find like a counterexample that suggests that maybe analysis that someone's done doesn't really extend as far as they thought it would. Comparing and contrasting is also an interesting project, but it's often a lot of work. So going back to this, women in Nike advertising campaign, let's say that I write, a really good research, find a lot of really good articles on women in Nike, and I want to compare that to say women in other sort of athletic apparel or other running wear companies, and understand what are things that are similar and what are areas where they might differ. And this is something you can do, but you really need to be careful with this one. Compare and contrast requires you to develop a really thorough understanding of multiple different sort of branches. It's not enough for me to develop an analysis on women in Nike ad campaigns. I also need to develop that analysis just as thoroughly as any other campaign I want to compare it to. And it's really incumbent on you as a researcher to do this. So comparing and contrasting is something that might appear to be easy, but it's actually sort of much more work. And in many ways it's difficult, but often rewarding if you can do it right. Finally, ask what if. If you're looking at a question that seems interesting, ask what if things were a little different, or what if this article or this campaign was copy techniques from another campaign, or what if this analysis just doesn't work quite the way the author says it does. Develop those points. Remember, you're not expected to necessarily agree with every article you find in the scholarly literature. You just need to acknowledge it. Scholars disagree with each other all the time, and sometimes disagreement makes for really interesting questions. Next slide, please. So question the significance. Again, we're going back to this so what question. At this point, you need to start thinking about how so what applies to your question, right? Why? It's not enough that it's interesting to you. It should be interesting to someone else, and you should be able to frame it that way, that this research matters. Next slide, please. So from question to topic to problem. So here's a good format for sort of finishing this process. Topic. So this is a little review sheet I've written out. You might want to write it down. Topic. I'm studying blank. Question. I want to find out what, why, how, blank. Significance. This is the so what question. What am I accomplishing in this paper in order to help my reader understand blank? And the last thing we're going to talk about is the problem. So the problem really is the best part of the research. After you developed a question and developed a sort of a significance of it, you're going to turn that into a problem. So not knowing things is something that, academics find frustrating, right? We like knowing stuff. But problems can extend beyond this. What if, your advertising campaign, if by not understanding it, we are missing out on some small picture of how, women are portrayed in media, or we are missing out on some interesting similarities, or some interesting areas where the research you've done shows that the scholarly field might have made some mistakes in their understanding of a topic. These are kind of problems, the hooks that really kind of draw your reader in. So problematize your research, introduce problems into the process. Next slide. On problems. Problems are tough to get right, and you will spend years working on this, but it's really rewarding when you finally hit upon a problem that really impacts your field in a meaningful way. So I'm going to share a little advice that I got when I was sort of first starting grad school. You don't need to solve big problems to write well. In fact, given your time constraints, claiming to solve a huge problem hampers your credibility with readers. So I was doing research on, how people in Seattle use mobile devices on public buses. And this was too broad. I just didn't have time to do it because, there's a lot of buses in the greater Seattle area. There are a lot of different kinds of mobile devices people use. So the problem, at least the way my advisor explained it, was that the problem I'd selected was just too big to solve. So while my problem was, kind of impactful, and while this question really could tell us a lot of what people do on their commutes, I needed to narrow it down further. But when I was doing this research, you can see the problem in your mind. It leads us places. Right? If I can tell you how people use mobile phones, this might be data that maybe the city of Seattle would find interesting. Maybe a private company that's trying to market apps to people who ride a bus would find this interesting. These problems are especially relevant in the private sector. So no one will ever pay you to produce research for the sake of producing research. If you're working for a financial institution or an accounting firm or some kind of company, your research needs to take us somewhere. It needs to solve a problem that people are facing. So expect that this is a duty you need to embrace and a challenge you need to confront. It is definitely tricky, but it's worth your attention and time to do it right. Next slide, please. Now onto the sources section. Primary sources we've covered earlier. These are kind of the raw data that you collect. If you're looking at, for example, an advertising campaign, the actual advertising images are your raw primary data. If you're looking at, a private company, for example, their financial records might be your primary sources. But it just depends on the thing you're studying. In general, the rule of thumb for primary sources is they are directly, generated by the entity you are trying to study. So, for example, in history, a primary source is oftentimes an autobiography, a speech, a letter, anything written by or created by the person you're trying to analyze. Secondary sources are a little trickier. These are research reports, that is peer-reviewed articles that use primary data to solve problems. So all the databases we're going to look at in the second part of this lecture, delve into how do I get at good research reports and good peer-reviewed content that is sort of up to the appropriate levels of academic standards and scrutiny. What peer review means is that another professional in the field looked at your article and confirmed that you were, adequately and sufficiently using your data to address a problem, and there weren't substantial methodological problems with it. And this is something important because sometimes, especially when you're just starting out and these sort of primary and secondary, a little confusing, students occasionally make mistakes. The reality is we're all human. We're all going to occasionally cite something we shouldn't. So pay attention to this now. Not just because something looks like an academic source does not necessarily mean that it is one. If you're getting something out of a library database, don't worry about it. That means that a library database is something that a librarian or an information professional went in, vetted the content, and confirmed that at least it was peer-reviewed. They may not agree with it, but we know that it's peer-reviewed research that you can cite. As we'll talk about a little later in the presentation, though, if you try to go outside of sort of library databases, you're going to start running into problems. So use library resources. They're available. Do the easy thing on this one. Lastly are the tertiary sources. These are synthesis reports for general readers. Popular publications like the New York Times is kind of a tertiary source. Books are kind of tertiary sources at times. But it's not peer-reviewed content is the crucial part. It's just a synthesis for someone who's a general reader. So it's a dumbed down version really of what an academic or what a scholar is really trying to get at. Now you can still use these. They're a good resource and sometimes good sounding boards for ideas, but you're not going to want to cite them. most of your citations really should be your primary data and your secondary data. In fact, all of your citations should be this, unless you're dealing with like a truly kind of unique field of study. And in this case, you really need to go to an instructor earlier and explain that, you know, I found this tertiary source that seems perfect, and they'll have a conversation as to whether or not you can cite it. But probably not. Almost all, if not all of your citations, should be a combination of primary and secondary research reports. Next slide. If you don't know, ask. Apply this rule at every stage of the process because you can get into no end of trouble. Research problems do not get better once you've introduced them. They just compound and get worse and worse until they're eventually addressed. So for example, I was writing, you know, like going back to this bus research problem, right? Like I initially had a topic that was too broad. And I tried to answer that question. And it only became evident at every step of that process that the topic I was working on was just too broad. So if I'd taken a moment to sort of stop and ask myself, is this too broad? I could have saved myself hours of work. So, you know, talk to your peers, talk to your professor, talk to a librarian. If you're running into something that seems like a problem, chances are it is one. Next, if you're citing data from content you're getting outside of a library database, be very, very careful about how you do it. So, for example, like, let's say you look at someone who has a PhD, and you're like, look, you know, it's a PhD, it's a doctoral degree from a university, that means it's peer-reviewed, right? And the answer is a pretty resounding no. Just because someone has a PhD does not make their personal blog like credible in the eyes of the scholarly community. Also, like, you know, if you're reading a PhD online, apply a little bit of healthy skepticism, right? Like, you know, as a little fun experiment, Google what happens by a PhD. So there are a number of programs where you can get a doctorate in between 15 and 30 days as long as you send them a check for $200. So just because someone's blog says PhD from X university does not make them an expert. Like, the process by which scholarly research is published is that an article is taken to a journal. That content is then peer-reviewed by the editors and other practitioners in the field. And assuming this, like, the peer review is completed satisfactory, it is then published. So this means that there's been a lot of eyes on it and a lot of experts have looked at it, and it has been appropriately vetted. If it's not peer-reviewed, really, like, be very, very, very careful about citing it because it can get you into a lot of trouble. Like, there may or may not be some exceptions, but if you're finding something that seems like this should be, you know, an article you want to use, but it's not peer-reviewed, you need to either talk to your instructor or talk to your librarian. Because if you cite something that's not peer-reviewed and it makes a claim that's false, that can impact your research in a pretty big way, obviously. Anyway, next slide. So also we're going to get into a little bit here how the writing process works. You know, we've talked a little bit earlier about your introduction, so I'm not going to dwell on this too long. But talk about your topic's background. You know, introduce the statement, the problem, the response to the problem. Introduce these things now. Think of the introduction as kind of your hook that draws readers in. On your conclusion, so a lot of you, right, will just, well, a lot of people that we've conditioned through our system of higher education will look at the conclusion and do it kind of through this rote memorization process where you just summarize yourself. Don't do that. Don't repeat yourself, right? Conclusions are a unique moment where you can kind of sum up what you've done and put an interesting spin on it. Quotes, anecdotes, use them to hold your reader's attention here. And also, you know, use your conclusion to have a moment to say something interesting about the data you gathered. You know, you did all this work, you might as well say something about it.